The streets of Boston shimmered with autumn colors. The crisp morning and evening air announced the advancing season as the spire of St. Paul's Church cast its shadow in the twilight. Elizabeth Watson finished her daily logs in the hospital staff room. The aroma of hot coffee rising from her mug gently enveloped her, soothing her tired body. "Elizabeth, thanks for staying late again. The boy with the fracture has calmed down and is now sleeping," her colleague said. Elizabeth looked up as the streetlights began to ignite one by one outside the window. As head nurse in the emergency room at Boston General Hospital, her days were always long. Yet the trust of her patients made it all worthwhile. She was especially good with children. Even the little ones who arrived crying ended up forgetting their tears when they saw Elizabeth's sweet smile. "Thanks, I also finished the notes for tomorrow's shift," she replied, glancing at her watch. If she hurried, she could get home before her husband, James. Tonight's dinner would be roast beef, his favorite dish. If she started cooking as soon as she arrived, they could enjoy a hot meal together. James, who worked as a manager at an investment bank, was an exemplary husband. Despite his busy schedule, he always helped around the house and never missed their weekend custom of attending church with Elizabeth. They had been married for 3 years and had no children. Their life together seemed the perfect picture of happiness. James always had thoughtful gestures for Elizabeth, like preparing bagels with cream cheese for breakfast. Their vacations were the envy of the neighborhood wives. But what stood out most was James's close relationship with his sister Rachel. Everyone in the community knew her well. Successful as a luxury real estate agent, Rachel possessed beauty, intelligence, and a full life. Even with her busy schedule, she always made time to visit her brother and sister-in-law. Elizabeth and Rachel were inseparable. Elizabeth considered her a true sister, visiting her house 2 or 3 times a week, and during the holidays, the 3 of them often went to the local farmers market together to pick out dinner ingredients. Rachel's presence added a special touch to Elizabeth's life. Rachel would appear unexpectedly after work, always in good spirits, ready to share the latest gossip or ask for career advice. Although Elizabeth secretly worried that Rachel seemed to have decided to remain single, she never pressured her to reveal her reasons. "Oh, Elizabeth, working late again? It's quite cold, don't you think?" Rachel said as Elizabeth was about to leave the hospital. Before she could answer, her mother-in-law, Martha, arrived at the emergency room. Martha regularly visited the hospital as a volunteer. For Elizabeth, she was not only her mother-in-law but also a good friend, understanding and supportive. The way Martha carried on with such strength even after losing her husband was something Elizabeth deeply admired. "Yes, but I'm finished for today. Martha, would you like to have dinner with us?" "I'm sure James would love it," Elizabeth asked with a smile. "Thank you, dear, but I'll pass this time. I have plans with Rachel. That girl has been acting a little strange lately, and as her mother, I'd like to talk to her," Martha replied with a slight expression of concern. However, she quickly recovered her soft smile before saying goodbye. Elizabeth pondered how fortunate she was to have such a warm family. Despite being her in-laws, few people were lucky enough to have such close and genuine relationships. James and Rachel had lost their father shortly after their parents divorced. That blow had united them even more, creating a strong, almost enviable bond. The framed photos in their house clearly reflected this. In every image, the siblings' smiles conveyed a difficult-to-explain complicity. Elizabeth smiled with pride. They were both admirable people. She put on her red jacket and took the subway back home, traversing the quiet residential area of Brookline. Upon getting off, she walked along the row of houses until she reached her own, with its white fence and welcoming ambience that always made her feel at peace. She could see the lights on in her house windows. The Halloween decorations at the entrance swayed gently in the autumn breeze. Elizabeth walked towards the door with light steps. Seeing Rachel's car parked outside, she thought that perhaps the 3 of them would have dinner together tonight. Meanwhile, in the emergency room of Boston General Hospital, the fluorescent lights emitted their characteristic white glow. The night shift was unusually quiet, with only a few patients arriving outside of normal hours. Elizabeth methodically entered the nursing records into the digital system, focused on her work. Beside her, Sarah, a new nurse, began to prepare for the shift change with the arrival of dawn. Outside, a cold autumn rain began to fall silently. "Mrs. Watson, would you like some coffee?" Sarah asked, offering her a cup with the unmistakable aroma of the break room's pot coffee. Elizabeth accepted with a slight smile. Thanks, it's quiet tonight. As soon as she uttered those words, the emergency radio crackled to life. Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment. That feeling was familiar to anyone who worked in emergency medicine. The choppy voices on the radio put everyone on alert. Emergency transport from a luxury hotel in the waterfront district. Fall from an upper floor. 2 unconscious people. After a brief silence, the emergency room sprang into action. In a matter of seconds, the atmosphere went from calm to a whirlwind of movement. Elizabeth's body reacted immediately. Sarah, prepare for 2 critical patients. Call Dr. Lee and Dr. Mark, she ordered precisely. Instructions flew back and forth as the night shift staff in the emergency room prepared at their respective stations. Everything worked like a well-rehearsed choreography, with silent coordination between healthcare professionals. Monitors, infusion pumps, ventilators, all the equipment was ready to be used as needed. Outside, the rain intensified, beating hard against the windows and echoing in the emergency room. But over that sound, the roar of the siren approached rapidly. Elizabeth unconsciously brought a hand to her chest. This should have been just another emergency transfer. But tonight it was different somehow. The automatic door burst open, letting in the emergency personnel. A gust of cold wind and rain swept into the room as the blood-soaked stretchers were hurriedly pushed inside. That scene was instantly etched into Elizabeth's retina. The first to enter was a man. His blonde hair was stained with blood. He wore a navy blue suit too familiar. On his left hand, a wedding ring gleamed under the white light of the emergency room. Elizabeth's world seemed to enter slow motion. The voices of the emergency personnel sounded distant, as if coming from underwater. After him, they brought in a woman. Her long black hair was covered in blood. Her designer dress was torn. On her neck, a necklace. Elizabeth didn't need to see it twice. It was Rachel. Speechless, breathless, the 2 people who had just entered the trauma room were her husband, James, and her sister-in-law, Rachel. The alcoholic scent of a luxury hotel bar still clung to their rain-soaked bodies. Why? Why are they like this? Elizabeth's voice trembled. At that moment, the doctor entered the room. Mark Smith, head of the emergency department, stood before her. The hem of his white coat brushed the blood-stained floor. Elizabeth, you shouldn't look. We'll explain when the police arrive. How long did it take for her mind to grasp the meaning of those words? In Dr. Smith's eyes, deep sympathy was reflected, but nothing could soften the blow of the reality around her. The voices of the staff swirled together with the sound of emergency preparations, the alarms of the monitors, the urgent calls to the operating room. All those noises seemed to come from far away, as if she were trapped in a dream she couldn't wake up from. Elizabeth took a step back, staggering. Her back hit the wall, but her eyes did not move from the 2 figures in front of her. The blood of both mingled on the floor. The blood flowed like a red stream. Elizabeth, let's go to the prayer room, the chaplain, Father Michael, said, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. The hem of his black robe crossed the stream of blood on the floor. Praying is the only thing you can do now. Without saying more, Father Michael silently guided her. Elizabeth could barely walk. Her steps were unsteady. In the hallway, the hospital staff had already gathered, having heard the rumors. No one said anything. They just looked at her. Were they looks of compassion or suspicion? It was impossible to know. The prayer room door opened, and the dim light cast a long shadow of the cross on the wall. Outside, the rain beat harder. Elizabeth felt her knees give way. Why were they at that luxury hotel? From the window, new ambulance sirens wailed in the distance. For the world, it was just another night in the emergency room. For Elizabeth, everything had changed forever. Tears fell on the soft carpet, disappearing without a trace. Father Michael continued his prayer in a low voice, filling the room with words of comfort. But Elizabeth's nightmare was just beginning. Elizabeth waited for the police interrogation. Father Michael sat quietly beside her. Outside, the eastern sky began to show a faint hint of dawn. 2 detectives entered the visiting room. The older detective approached Elizabeth, his voice grave. I'm David Morrison, Boston Police. This is my partner, Sarah Chun. Elizabeth's body began to tremble slightly. Father Michael gently squeezed her hand. They're alive. They're in surgery. Both are in critical condition, but they survived. Elizabeth nodded weakly. Detective Chun, Detective Morrison continued, speaking softly. We received a report about a fall from the balcony of a suite on the 15th floor of the Intercontinental Hotel regarding your husband and sister-in-law. Detective Morrison paused before continuing. However, based on security camera footage and the condition of the scene, we have determined that it was not an accident. Several thoughts swirled in Elizabeth's mind. Why were they at that hotel? Why so late at night? Why from the balcony? We checked their smartphones and found this, Detective Chun said, taking out a tablet and showing her photos. Elizabeth's eyes widened as she saw the screen. In James's messaging app, a message to Rachel read, "We can't continue this relationship. I can't stand betraying Elizabeth any longer. Let's end it all." Rachel had replied, "I feel the same. Let's end our love, one that no one could understand. But I want one last time together. Just the two of us." After reviewing the hotel booking records, we discovered they'd been reserving the same room for the past 3 months. Detective Morrison's voice seemed to come from far away. Empty packages of sleeping pills and 2 suicide notes were found in the room. The detectives waited in silence. Various memories flitted through Elizabeth's mind like a kaleidoscope. Rachel's smile during weekend lunches, the unfamiliar perfume that lingered in the master bedroom, her husband's increasingly late returns, Rachel's words about never marrying, the strangely intimate photos of the siblings in the family album. We've received testimony from Martha Watson, Detective Chun continued quietly. According to your mother-in-law, this abnormal relationship began around the time of their parents' divorce, 15 years ago. After their father's death, the dependence between them deepened. The sound of the rain intensified. The marriage was a facade? Elizabeth asked in a surprisingly calm voice. Yes. We found words of apology for you saved on James Watson's phone. He wrote a note saying the marriage was solely to maintain social appearances. They attempted suicide twice. We have to conclude that after taking large doses of sleeping pills, the security camera caught them holding hands as they jumped from the balcony, said Detective Morrison. The words trailed off. We also found a confession scheduled to be published on social media. It was set to automatically post at 9 a.m. this morning, Detective Chun said, operating the tablet. It was James's social media account. I apologize for ending years of lies and sin in this way. My sister, Rachel, and I have been trapped in a love that no one could understand. Elizabeth, I truly regret involving you. When she finished reading the confession, Elizabeth stood up calmly. Outside the window, the dawn light began to faintly color the rain clouds. I must go to their rooms. As their assigned nurse, I have a duty as head nurse to protect the lives of patients, she said in a firm voice without a tremor. Elizabeth, you're completely innocent. You bear no responsibility for their actions, said Detective Morrison. Elizabeth nodded slightly at his words. Thank you. But right now, saving patients' lives is a priority. Elizabeth took a deep breath and left the room. Rumors were already starting to circulate among the hospital's staff in the hallway. However, she walked towards the nurses' station with dignified steps. A week after the incident, the October sunlight streaming through the window of the intensive care unit felt strangely white. Elizabeth stood in the hallway outside the hospital room, her hand on the doorknob, unable to move. Mrs. Watson, you don't need to push yourself. The voice came from behind her. The ICU chief physician. I'm fine. I'm the head nurse of this hospital, she replied, although her hand trembled. For a week, she had been unable to enter the room. Days plagued by nausea and insomnia. Food wouldn't go down and her stomach wouldn't even accept coffee. Still, she came to work every day and fulfilled her usual duties. Elizabeth, let's go home today, her colleague Sarah said, gently putting a hand on her shoulder. But Elizabeth shook her head. I need to check the nursing records. The records were filled with cold medical terms, and each time she read them her heart clenched. The rumors had spread throughout the hospital. The looks from colleagues passing in the hallway, the conversations that stopped abruptly in the break room, the occasional whispered "poor thing" that reached her ears. A week ago, she had been the proud head nurse of this hospital, Having earned the trust of the staff with patience and respect, Martha was waiting for her in the waiting room. The mother of James and Rachel seemed to have aged 10 years in a week. "Let me explain everything," Martha said, her voice filled with exhaustion. 15 years ago, right after the divorce, I noticed it. But I didn't want to acknowledge it, the abnormality of their relationship. It was all a result of my continued denial. Elizabeth sat silently and listened to Martha's words. The family breakdown after the divorce, the suicide of their father, and how the relationship between the siblings, who should have supported each other, gradually became twisted. Then the sham marriage to maintain appearances. "I am so sorry to have involved you," Martha said, tears falling to the waiting room floor. That night, Elizabeth visited the church for the first time since. The usual place of Sunday worship now felt strangely distant. "The Lord gives us trials, but never trials we cannot bear." Father Michael's words resonated in the church. "But Father, why?" Elizabeth asked. "The darkness in human hearts is deep, but it is also the human heart that can shed light on that darkness," the priest replied. The setting sun filtering through the stained glass windows tinted Elizabeth's praying figure red at the altar. The next day, as she was about to submit a transfer request to the hospital's Human Resources Department, an unexpected event occurred. "Elizabeth, we have a request," they told her. All the emergency department staff were gathered before her. "We know you're not the type to quit. You haven't done anything wrong. This department needs you. Let's get through this together." Hearing her colleague's words, tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes. The emotion she had desperately contained all week finally released all at once. Elizabeth entered her husband's room for the first time. James, paralyzed from the waist down, turned his face when he saw her. "I can't find the words to apologize," James said, his voice raspy. "Your apologies won't change anything," Elizabeth replied, surprisingly calmly. "I will fulfill my duties as a nurse, but this will be our last conversation." When she left the room, Elizabeth's back was straight. A patient passing in the hallway smiled kindly at her. "Mrs. Watson, thanks to your nursing care, my wound has healed." Those words restored some warmth to Elizabeth's heart. On the weekend, Elizabeth went to see a new apartment, farther from the Brookline district and closer to the hospital. From the windows, she could see the Charles River flowing. "What do you think of this room?" the real estate agent asked. Elizabeth breathed deeply, filling her lungs with fresh air. "I think I can start over here." At dusk, as she prepared to move, Elizabeth removed her wedding ring. A white mark remained where the ring had been. It would take time for that mark to disappear, but there was no need to rush. A year later, in autumn, children's laughter echoed in the pediatric emergency room in the hallway of Boston General Hospital's department. "Mrs. Watson." A girl in a wheelchair greeted Elizabeth. She smiled softly and patted the girl's head. A year after being transferred to the pediatric emergency department, Elizabeth's smile began to shine again. It was becoming genuine again. "Big sister, can I go home today?" "Yes, you've done very well." When she pulled out a piece of candy from her coat pocket, the girl's eyes sparkled. Her colleagues watched the scene warmly. Since Mrs. Watson had arrived, it seemed the children were recovering faster. Dr. Michael Clark, the pediatrician, spoke kindly. He was a new doctor who had arrived 6 months ago, always with a friendly smile. Sometimes he offered Elizabeth coffee. The new apartment overlooking the Charles River had become Elizabeth's place of peace. On weekends, she had begun to enjoy buying fresh vegetables at the local farmer's market and cooking for herself. On Sunday mornings, Elizabeth still attended St. Paul's Church, however. She now participated in a different Mass. Father Michael quietly observed these changes. "The light has begun to dwell within you." On her way back from church, Martha called Elizabeth. Her relationship with her mother-in-law had actually become deeper than before. Yes, little by little. The two entered a cafe near the church. From the window seat, Elizabeth could see the streets of Boston beginning to show their autumn colors. The voice of James was fading in her mind. Elizabeth silently picked up her coffee cup. After the incident a year ago, James's life had changed drastically. With no prospect of recovery from his lower body paralysis and bankrupt from high medical costs, he was fired from the investment bank and now lived alone in a suburban care center. Martha visited him occasionally, Rachel's situation was even more serious. She was diagnosed with a serious mental illness and forced to remain in long-term care at a psychiatric facility. Her real estate license was revoked, and she couldn't escape financial ruin from medical costs. They said she still called out for her brother. If only I had realized it sooner. Martha, that wasn't your responsibility. Elizabeth gently took her mother-in-law's hand. We must look forward and live. Outside the cafe, the autumn sunlight was turning the street trees golden. Elizabeth suddenly smiled. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from the hospital. Sorry, emergency patient. Ah, that's the Elizabeth we know. Martha smiled affectionately. On her way back to the hospital, Elizabeth looked at the sky. Her life had changed drastically since that rainy night a year ago. Although she had lost much, she had also gained something. Upon entering the pediatric emergency department, she heard the usual sounds of children. Dr. Michael approached with documents in hand. Mrs. Watson, if you're free this weekend. Elizabeth thought for a moment before nodding slightly. Perhaps it's time to start opening the door to a new life, little by little. At dusk, Elizabeth watched the sunset from the hospital window. The mark from her ring was now barely visible. Accept the past as the past, but keep looking forward and live. Mrs. Watson. She heard a child's voice behind her. Elizabeth turned around. Her profile, illuminated by the setting sun, showed an unmistakable strength. Tomorrow would bring a new day, and surely a new hope awaited beyond the window. The autumn winds gently stirred the street trees. Elizabeth took a deep breath and tucked the candies into her coat pocket. Tonight, too, she would deliver her prescriptions of smiles.